It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Nancy Schuldt. Nancy Schuldt has served as the Fond du Lac Water Projects Coordinator since 1997. She has a BS in Biology from the University of Dayton and an MA in Aquatic Ecology from the University of Kansas. She developed the band's water quality standards and monitoring program, has directed research into fish contaminants and sediment chemistry to characterize mercury impacts to the Fond du Lac band members, collaborated on research into the wild rice ecology and toxicity, as well as watershed hydrologic modeling to inform management and restoration efforts. She participates in numerous local, regional, and national and binational working groups to ensure the tribal perspective is presented. She initiated the tribe's non-point source management program and leads the band's environmental review of mining and energy industry impacts to trusted resources. With that, please join me in welcoming Nancy.
So it's really an honor to have been invited to come speak. It's a little intimidating, I'll admit. When I was approached about doing this back in sometime over the summer, there was kind of this working title. We just want you to talk about tribal water resource issues. So that's kind of the title that we've been going with. It sounds really kind of bland. They said you can change that title if you wish. So I did. But I thought that we would just stick with the bland title for purposes of the program because autocorrect really has a hard time with Ojibwe language. But I wanted to introduce this right off the bat because before I launch into my comments at warp speed, I just want to talk a little bit about the framing, the foundation for how we approach water protection working for the tribe. I am not a tribal member, but I've been working there for 20 years. I've learned a lot about Ojibwe culture. Yesterday I was at the water bar. Have any of you tried the water at the water bar? Had a conversation with a young Dakota woman who was serving me mani and describing that for her community, water's not a resource, it's not a commodity, it's a relative. And we have a relationship with it. And it supports us, it takes care of us, so we have to take care of it. And that's exactly the message that I have gotten working for the Fond du Lac community for the last 20 years. Water, or Nibi, is sacred. It's the lifeblood of Mother Earth. We have to take care of it. We inherited the water resources from our ancestors and previous generations, and it's upon us to take care of it for the future generations. And just one last little bit of insight. In Ojibwe culture, women are considered the keepers of the water because of the special relationship between women and water and giving life, giving birth. And so in some way, I think that might be why I have felt accepted as a Western scientist working for the tribe. So I would like to start some of my comments today just talking about the tribal water quality program that we've built at Fond du Lac and where it has taken us, what kind of the background is and the support for it, and the opportunities that we've had working primarily to protect the water resources of the reservation. But after that, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how we've tried to take the capacity that we've developed and to expand our influence, so to speak, outside the reservation boundaries, in areas where the band still retains usufructuary rights, the rights to hunt, fish, and gather. So, 11 fiercely independent tribes in the state of Minnesota, 7 Ojibwe bands, 4 Dakota bands. How many in this room have worked in some fashion, some partnership or collaboration or engagement with any of the tribes in Minnesota? That's about what I expected to see. Excuse me, as I talk a little bit about the program we have at Fond du Lac, I'd like to circle back to that and talk about how there are some opportunities that I hope that you will consider taking advantage of. All of these tribes have water quality programs. They have water resource priorities, they have capacity, and they can be really good partners. The reservation where I work, Fond du Lac Reservation up in northeastern Minnesota, was created under the Treaty of La Pointe in 1854. It's a very water-rich environment, 101,000 acres, and surface waters and wetland resources cover about half of the acreage of the reservation, including the St. Louis River, which forms the northeastern boundary of the reservation. So water resources, huge priority for the Fond du Lac Band. And in fact, before I came to work for the band, they were already setting the stage for the work that I was hired in to do. One important piece of information is that the Ojibwe people did not originate in this place, in the Great Lakes Basin. Originally, they were on the eastern seaboard, up on the Atlantic coast, up into the maritime provinces. But many millennia ago, they had prophecies that told them that in order to survive and to thrive, they needed to move westward. And so over the course of centuries, they did just that, moving through the St. Lawrence Seaway, across the Great Lakes, and they were guided by a vision, by prophecies that told them they would find the place that they were meant to be when they encountered the food that grows on the water, which is monomen, or wild rice. And so, again, another important relation to the Ojibwe people that I will be spending some time talking about today. So in order to do the work that we do with our water quality program at Fond du Lac, as I said, the tribe had already started down a particular path to develop a formal water quality standards program. Now, of over 500 some recognized tribes in the United States, only about 50 tribes have federally approved water quality standards. And this is accomplished through a relatively onerous legal process. It can take a lot of time, a lot of legal and financial resources. But this treatment as a state determination is a legal determination that EPA can make under authorization under federal statute. We have to make a showing that we are a federally recognized tribe, that we have the capacity to carry out this program, and that authority, that jurisdiction, only applies to waters within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. And importantly, for each piece of the Clean Water Act that we have requested programmatic funding and development for, we have had to go through a separate TAS process to get monitoring money under 106. 303C is the Water Quality Standards Program. 319 to get a non-point source program, separate TAS determination. Our water quality standards under Section 303C of the Clean Water Act are just like any other state's water quality standards. We have designated uses that are specific to the tribe and tribal priorities. We are looking to protect ecosystems and human health through development of narrative and numeric criteria that protect a subsistence lifestyle. We have anti-degradation policies and in fact have identified our Tier 3 or outstanding reservation resource waters. The most productive wild rice waters on the reservation have that Tier 3 protection where we will not allow any degradation of water quality to occur. But primarily, the reason to pursue a path like this, to have a formal water quality standards program, is to be able to exercise sovereignty in the modern world, to be able to make decisions about protecting these vital resources and relatives, regardless of what the ownership is. Only about half of the reservation within the boundaries of the reservation is owned or controlled by the band. Now, just a glimpse of some of the resources that I get to work with. We have beautiful recreational swimming and fisheries lakes. We have lovely little fish nurseries, primary fisheries lakes. We've got wild rice waters. We've got waters that we are seeking to preserve even just for aesthetic and cultural purposes. Many of our waters have virtually no human disturbance in the watershed, which means that I get to take care of some really high quality resources. We have trout streams, and then again, We have jurisdiction over about 23 river miles of the St. Louis River, which is the largest U.S. tributary to Lake Superior. We share jurisdiction with the state of Minnesota and down near the estuary with the state of Wisconsin. In our on-reservation program, in order to implement those water quality standards, we have established a really robust and comprehensive water quality monitoring program. That was maybe the most fun part of my job, was when I was first starting and they said, you need to do some monitoring. It's like, all right, I'll work on the lakes. I'll work in a canoe or in waders. We do, as I said, we've got a monitoring and assessment program now for nearly 20 years. We've engaged in basic research within the reservation and also with partners. And we've identified through that monitoring program some areas that have needed restoration. And so we've been able to create the justification and seek funding and partners to be able to do some really interesting restoration projects as well. Our monitoring program is very much tied to the nature and quality and use of the resource. So the way we monitor our wild rice lakes is a little bit different than what we do for our fisheries lakes. We have a stream monitoring program, but that's different than what we do for our monitoring on the St. Louis River, which is a large river. And as I said, it's a comprehensive physical, chemical, biological monitoring program. We've been using biological communities as indicators for all of our different classes of water because, well, that was my background, but also because we believe that what lives there is really best able to tell the story of the quality. And so just generally, it's been our goal through our monitoring program to be able to detect now. We have sufficient data on any long-term trends in water quality, to be able to detect climate change impacts, and also to be able to demonstrate compliance with our water quality standards, because we are required to do that type of reporting as well to the US EPA. And just as importantly as all of that technological data that we collect and analytical data, we do a lot of phenology and we have a lot of value for observational data. To be able to participate in the loon surveys and the frog call surveys, noting resident and migratory waterfowl on our rice lakes. And then you get that call in the middle of July about what is this thing that's growing in my lake? How many of you recognize the bryozoan? Have you ever gotten that phone call from somebody saying, what the heck is this? And being a little squeamish about it? It's a teachable moment, I'll tell you. We've also been able to invest in some technology to enable us to do some high-definition bathymetric mapping for all of our lakes, so that if we want to do some modeling or characterization, we've got that framework to rely upon. We've done some sediment investigations, along with our air quality program, where we've been monitoring mercury deposition now for over 20 years. We've been really concerned about mercury and as it moves through the environment and what the exposure is for fish and for human health and wildlife health. So we've done sediment assessments. We were really able to rule out other environmental contaminants that could have been of concern, like PCBs or lead, and really focus our efforts at understanding what's going on with mercury. And that has translated into work with, in collaboration with Minnesota Department of Health on culturally sensitive fish consumption advice. It just is simply not acceptable to tell band members to not eat fish. Fish has been an important part of a subsistence lifestyle. There's treaty fishing that is a very important part of exercising treaty rights. And what we have strived to do is to understand where the risk is the greatest and to provide advice on what kind of fish is it safe to eat, how often, and who can eat what. And we've also engaged in directed research. Wild rice ecology obviously is a really important issue. There's a lot of traditional knowledge that comes with the tribal community about how to protect and manage our reservation rice resources. But we also want to take advantage of the jurisdictional and regulatory authorities that we have to be able to be as protective as possible. And so understanding basic ecological needs of Mahnomen, and also understanding in pretty great detail what the issue is with sulfate and sulfide toxicity. We've been engaged in research along that issue for a number of years, both before and since the MPCA took that up as part of their water quality rule revisions. We've done some paleo investigations as well, partnering with the LACCOR facility here at the University of Minnesota, primarily interested in what the sediments can tell us about wild rice phytoliths and the presence of excuse me, of wild rice, so that in areas where we are trying to do restoration, we can look back in time to see whether rice once existed there and understand where we can maybe most effectively apply our efforts to do restoration. We've been engaged in hydrologic research as well. Again, the Stony Brook watershed is where our wild rice lakes are located. And hydrology is such a fundamental component of optimal wild rice habitat that we've tried to understand it as best we can. We're dealing with a landscape that was ditched 100 years ago with the intent of draining those nasty swamps so that homesteaders could come in and make nice farms. And we're left with the damage and the degradation to our wild rice waters and need to find ways to overcome that. So we've worked with USGS and NRCS to better understand the surface and the shallow groundwater hydrology in this watershed. And having the database that we've had and the opportunities to do some targeted investigations meant that when we were hit with that catastrophic flood in 2012, we were able to take advantage of an opportunity to address an issue that had been kind of the bane of my existence for a while. We had a perched culvert on a trout stream, and it was embedded in this embankment that stands about 50 feet tall, and it was perched about 5 or 6 feet on the downstream and grossly undersized. Well, overnight, it was gone. And because we had not only the stream gauging data, but we had actually done a kind of a recon, a feasibility study on how to fix this issue, we were able to prevail with FEMA and U.S. Department of Transportation to get what they call a betterment. We're not ever going to have to worry about an undersized perched culvert because we've got this beautiful new bridge. And again, the monitoring and assessment enabled us to identify areas that needed some help. Another area where we had a collapsed culvert on a small brook trout tributary. We were able to get money through our relationship with NRCS, some equip funding and some engineering design, and we were able to replace that with a properly sized and installed culvert. And with all of these projects that we do, we have a lot of pre-monitoring data and we do a lot of post-monitoring data to demonstrate, for instance, in this case, that right away we were really gratified to see that natural sinuosity in the upstream channel reestablish itself. We've got a LEED certified building for our natural resources, our resource management division, and we installed some demonstration projects. We've got this small green roof, we've got a rain garden, mainly to show how we can do this kind of a development in an environmentally sensitive way. And again, we use some of our 319 money to do some BMP performance monitoring to see how is that green roof compared to the not green roof that we had as kind of a paired watershed study, or how is the infiltration affecting the hydrograph in our rain garden. And then one small lake. We don't have a lot of ag on the reservation, but we had one small lake that has a very small watershed, has no inflow, no outflow. It's just basically this bathtub with a horse farm and some historic farming in the watershed. And again, because we had all of that data that showed that there was an impact from those practices, and we were also able to kind of drill down and understand that it was a problem mostly of internal phosphorus loading, we were able to seek a competitive 319 grant, work with NRCS to deal with the sources in the watershed, and then go in with a very targeted alum treatment and very successfully deal with that internal phosphorus loading. And again, the post-monitoring data shows that since that 2013 treatment, even in 2017, that reduction in summer chlorophyll is persisting. And then finally, to sum up our primary focus on the reservation is to also be able to train that next generation of water guardians. And so we do a lot of engagement and outreach with the youth, with the K through 12 Ojibwe school, to get them interested and engaged in the sciences so that they can take my place one day. And then also we've had an ongoing relationship with the university with some research experience for undergraduates. And we bring in REUs every summer that do some community-based research on issues that are important to the band in conjunction with academic researchers at UMD. And we focus on selecting applicants that are minorities or from underserved communities. And this has been a really gratifying opportunity on both levels. I've gotten a lot of feedback from some of our REUs about how now they can envision themselves working in this field and doing something important for their community. So, where that has taken us, I need to kind of wrap this up, but I want to talk about how building this capacity for our water program on the reservation has meant we have been able to engage off the reservation because we have that responsibility and that treaty-protected right to resources from off the reservation. And that St. Louis River connection is really looming large in how we engage and interact on off-reservation water resource issues. You can see the outline of the St. Louis River watershed. Embedded within that, you see the Fond du Lac Reservation is down here. But around most of that, you see this outline of the 1854 ceded territory. That is the area, one of the areas where Fond du Lac retains those treaty hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. You may realize that there's the Boundary Waters, Superior National Forest, the Mesabi Iron Range. There's a lot going on in this part of the state that has the potential to impact important treaty resources. And so with our capacity, we try to find a seat at the table when decisions are being made about these resources. If I look downstream, down into the estuary, one of the, I think it's 41 now, there's been a few delisted, Great Lakes areas of concern. The St. Louis River estuary is one of those areas of concern because of historic industrial pollution and habitat degradation and a number of beneficial use impairments. That is the Fond du Lac homeland, so it makes perfect sense that we would be engaged in the restoration of this area. We have an AOC coordinator that sits at the table with the AOC coordinator from the MPCA, the Minnesota and Wisconsin DNRs, and is part of the planning and the prioritization for the remedial work and the restoration work that is happening down there. We've been part of a natural resource damage assessment. We've been one of the natural resource trustees at a big site, the Interlake Duluth Tar site, both to help form the remedy that was to be implemented, and then now there's a settlement that is being finalized to do some additional habitat restoration work in that region. The same kind of process is gearing up right now at the U.S. Steel site. And again, this is an important area for the Fond du Lac Band. If you recall my comments about the Ojibwe migration, the sixth stopping place on that migration was right here, Spirit Island. No, I seem to have lost it. Right here in the middle of Spirit Lake, which is kind of a wide spot in the estuary, upstream of a lot of the other industrial impacts and the shipping channels. Fond du Lac recently was able to purchase Spirit Island and several other islands. And so we have a new investment and a new standing in that region, and we're very much engaged in how that remedy occurs and how cultural resources are also addressed. Part of the restoration that's happening down there includes a lot of wild rice restoration. And to their credit, the state agencies that are dealing with the need to delist this AOC recognize that restoring Monoman is maybe one of the best markers or indicators of how we are doing in our efforts to restore the estuary. There used to be thousands of acres of Monoman in that estuary. And so there's a very dedicated effort right now to reestablish Monoman in a lot of areas where there's really only remnant stands today. And I would point out that this area right down here, the village of Fond du Lac, which is at the very western end of the city of Duluth, again, that's the tribal homeland. That was the village of Fond du Lac before the reservation was created. So you can understand the attachment to place and why Fond du Lac would want to be engaged in the work that's being done in this place. We've also been part of restoring and reestablishing lake sturgeon populations. The two states, Minnesota and Wisconsin, have been working for decades to restore them down in the estuary. And tribal biologists have been working to gauge how that population is doing and to be able to document that they're now beginning to reproduce. But in the meantime, Fond du Lac has been stocking and restoring lake sturgeon upstream of the Minnesota power reservoirs, where there's this barrier to migration. And so for a while, they were just disappearing. We had no idea how effective that stocking was, but about 9 years ago, we started to get stories and pictures, and we were finally able to find some of these fish that we had stocked and get radio tags on them. So now we're tracking them and following them for the next few years until they can potentially reach reproductive age. Getting back to fish, for the entirety of the 20 years I've been working for the band, there has been just this laser-like focus on Monoman and fish. And to this day, that is primarily what I'm working on. And the problem that we have with mercury in fish in the St. Louis River watershed is relatively intractable. It's a tough one. The statewide mercury TMDL alone, the reductions under that effort are not going to be sufficient to remove the fish consumption restrictions from fish in this watershed. We need to do more. And we know that there are some things going on in the landscape, in the watershed, that we need to be looking at and making some hard decisions about. And to that end, just last year, one of the last actions of the Obama administration, the EPA and under the Obama administration, was to do rulemaking to enable tribes to seek TAS for a 303D program. That had always been an option, but there had never been any guidance or kind of a roadmap for how a tribe would go about setting up an impaired waters program. We intend to pursue that authority. We intend to jumpstart the TMDL process again in the St. Louis River watershed because it is just that important. And we're also dealing with pipelines. If you look at an aerial photo of the reservation, you can see where the pipeline corridor is. Even if they're buried, they are not out of mind. We have existing pipelines, and then there's the Line 3 replacement. We are very much engaged in the environmental review for that project. We know the kinds of impacts that the existing pipelines have had on the resources across our reservation. Let's just say they are significant and they are measurable. There's other hydrologic impacts in this watershed as well. There's extensive ditching not only on the reservation, as I mentioned earlier, but throughout other portions, the savanna, and then this middle portion, this vast peatland area in the middle of the St. Louis River watershed is extensively ditched. Again, kind of a lost effort at trying to establish traditional row crop agriculture. That can have an effect on mercury, as you might imagine, and mercury methylation and bioaccumulation. And then as we look upstream to the headwaters of the St. Louis River watershed, the Mesabi Iron Range. They've been mining there for 150 years. One of the biggest mining complexes in the world, certainly in North America. And there have been impacts. There's always impacts at the landscape level, at the water quality level. There's permanent effects. And so we have, because of that St. Louis River connection, because of that 1854 ceded territory connection, we're very much engaged in how mining is being regulated and allowed to expand. And that's just the ferrous mining. Now we've got sulfide mining on top of that. We began scrutinizing permits over 10 years ago and looking at environmental reviews of these expansions to ferrous mining, and we requested cooperating agency status for the PolyMet project. Again, not because the focus was on trying to stop mining or to get rid of mining, but to have a seat at the table to make sure that tribal concerns were clearly understood, that there could potentially be mitigation or changes made to project plans that would result in less degradation to important tribal resources. We work very closely and put a lot of pressure on our federal agency partners because of that trust responsibility that they have with the bands. And we're always mindful of how important it is to take a stance now so that these resources are available for future generations. We've taken on some of our own independent analysis when we don't believe that the analysis for the project is being done comprehensively or holistically or with any kind of cultural sensitivity. We took on a cumulative effects analysis for the PolyMet EIS. We were also concerned about how biased the socioeconomic analyses were for the PolyMet project, and so with our limited time and resources, we engaged with a consultant to do an ecosystem services valuation for the St. Louis River watershed. Because even though it's inherently against the tribal sensibility to talk about water in terms of monetizing it, what we find in these kinds of processes that in the absence of describing and assigning value, that the value is assumed to be zero. It's just simply not counted. So this was just a first shot at doing some ecosystem service valuation. We would really like to do some more of that. We're working in collaboration with the USGS to do hydrologic modeling of the St. Louis River watershed with a focus on groundwater and how mining impacts have changed the hydrology of this system, so that as future projects come up, we're not arguing about baseline conditions and how water is moving. Have a common understanding. And then finally, we've worked to build strong relationships and partnerships with other tribes across the region. We received an environmental exchange network grant from EPA 4 years ago to establish a regional tribal consortium for Monoman to set up a database so that we can share water quality and wild rice data across the region. And along with that, we established some standard methods, field methods for doing stand density. And so the idea then is for us to be able to talk about the quality and the condition of Monoman across what remains of its historic distribution, which used to be far wider than it is right now. Here in Minnesota, we're looking at really the last of the wild rice that used to exist across most of the eastern United States. It's something that I don't think most Minnesotans recognize, is just how rare and unique and valuable it is. And to that end, we're also engaging on a whole new pathway with Minnesota Department of Health to do a HIA, a health impact assessment, on how potential changes to wild rice water quality rules could affect tribal health, both individually and collectively. And that's something I'm really interested in following through, because it's enabled us to engage with community members and hear from them and document really heartfelt perspectives about what Monoman means to them and why it remains one of our biggest priorities. So as you can see, we're not just a little program operating on the reservation. We find ourselves on the front lines for a lot of the big, ugly issues that everybody in this room is dealing with in some capacity or another with regards to protecting water resources. I would just like to say that that also means there's a lot of opportunities, and not just for Fond du Lac. I guess I'd like to go back and re-ask the question that I started with. How many in the room have collaborated with or partnered with or otherwise engaged with Fond du Lac on water quality issues? Yeah, I think that's a pretty profound statement on where opportunities lie. You'll find that if you're seeking to restore a watershed, to make water quality improvements, that there are opportunities to work in partnership with the 11 tribes in Minnesota to accomplish those shared goals. And I was asked yesterday about how would you go about doing that? I mean, even though there's this governor's executive order directing state agencies to work with tribes, to consult with tribes when their actions or decisions might affect tribal resources, there's really no guidebook. And so just a couple of ideas on how you might think about going about establishing a working relationship with a tribe. It first of all starts out with building the relationship. And you'll find that there's probably some common goals that could be approached. It's really important to think about bringing tribes in very early in the process of a project. Don't wait until you've got it all figured out what you want to do and say, oh, let's see if we can get the tribes on board as well. That's not as effective, and it probably won't be as well received. I would just advise you to be respectful of cultural norms, and that there are many, many ways of knowing beyond just Western science. That's something I've certainly come to appreciate in the last 20 years. There's a long history with these tribal communities and the landscapes that they find themselves on right now. And there's also been a lot of exploitation over the years. So be cognizant of that there could be some feelings about how we've been down this road before and it didn't work out very well. I would encourage you to try to overcome that. And with that, I say thank you very much, Chi-miigwech, and be happy to take questions.
Great. So we've got a question here. Can you describe any success stories and challenges in integrating traditional knowledge with Western science?
Mm-hmm. Always challenges. Success stories potentially to come. And I would say that what I've come to appreciate in how Fond du Lac and some of the other tribes approach their wild rice management for their on-reservation resources. You can, as a state citizen, you can get a state license and you can go out and harvest monomen in any of the state lakes. But there's really no management, there's no enforcement or decisions made about how that happens. On reservation resources, we still have rice chiefs. We still have a committee that decides when the lakes are open and who gets to go out and how many boats get to go out. And when we're going to save one of the lakes for the elders, for instance, or for the youth so that they can learn, the next generation can learn. There's actually been some really good collaboration between the Minnesota DNR, especially the Shallow Lakes program, and tribal staff as well, talking about how potentially improvements could be made to how the state actually enforces and regulates the harvest of wild rice based upon what the tribes know about what is best for the rice. And if you've got more detailed questions about that, I'd be happy to talk to you about that afterwards.
Thank you. What barriers do young tribe members face that prevent them from entering careers related to environmental stewardship? And how can we help break down or overcome those barriers?
That's a really tough one. You may or may not have seen studies that have shown that the graduation rate for Native American students in the state of Minnesota is really about as poor as it is anywhere in the United States. In order for a tribal member, some 15-year-old that wants to be able to work for the reservation sometime in the future, to get them through high school is a huge, huge barrier. There's a lot of institutional barriers to seeing success measured by traditional metrics in our public schools and even in some of the tribal schools. So getting through high school and then to the point where they feel that they could succeed in college is also a big barrier. So we're working to provide those opportunities through the tribal college, through mentorship, as I mentioned. We're dealing with a lot of institutional and systematic problems that won't be solved by a single action or decision. But to the extent that opportunities can remain open, that students can be encouraged and mentored and shepherded through school and through post-secondary education, I think that gets us to the point in the not too distant future where we can see more of that intergenerational assumption. I've got some people working for me now that were REUs 5-10 years ago. So person by person, we're slowly making some changes.
Thank you. How is the band assessing and adapting to climate change impacts?
Oh, that's a great question. One of my colleagues is still in the room, I'm pretty sure, Darren, from the 1854 Treaty Authority. They manage off-reservation hunting, fishing, gathering rights for the Boys Ford and Grand Portage bands. And Fond du Lac is also a signatory to that treaty. So we work together all the time. And they took the lead. The 1854 Treaty Authority took the lead on a climate change vulnerability assessment and an adaptation plan for the 1854 ceded territories. And so we worked together on that to identify where we believe that the most vulnerable resources were, and then identify actions that we could take in our monitoring and our management, in our engagement outside the reservation to be able to respond to those effects, which we are already experiencing. Changes in forest cover type isn't just some esoteric phenomenon. I mean, those are important relatives, maple, sugar bush, birch bark, etc. If we see changes in those kinds of resources, that changes the way that band members practice traditional cultural activities. Hydrology, we're very much concerned about how that's going to affect wild rice, again, because it is so sensitive and has such a narrow tolerance for hydrologic change. There's some things we won't be able to do to compensate for that, but to the extent that we can build in some resiliency, to think about what might replace black ash when we lose that to the twin threats of climate change and emerald ash borer. We're already beginning to look at those and identify those problems and think about how to respond to them.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. We have one last question here that we can pose. I'm always impressed with the environmental ethic of Native American communities. How can that be fostered elsewhere in our society?
That's a really tough question. And I'm going to answer it with a non-answer. I would say that for me, it has been a very rewarding professional opportunity because my personal values, my ethic about the environment and the natural world really aligns very well with the Native American community ethic. That's not true for everybody. We all come from different backgrounds, and that all leads to different ways of arriving at decisions. And what I tell people is that in working for the tribe, I have the luxury of putting the resource first, always. I'll never go wrong if we make a decision or take a position of putting the resource first. I'm not sure that everybody has that freedom or luxury. And so I think that if there can be a growing awareness of how tribes are still here on this landscape, are still persisting, despite incredible efforts to get rid of them, the fact that we can still manage in a sustainable way the resources that were a gift from the Creator. A growing awareness, I think, of that mindset could potentially help foster a different mentality more broadly.
Good answer. Thank you, Nancy. Everybody, please join me in thanking Nancy for her talk today.
Thank you.